Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Hi, and welcome back to Agriculture in a Nutshell. Today we're going to talk about a specific fertility plan, or at least the beginnings of a fertility plan. And the reason I say beginnings, because if you really never have gotten in to your soil testing properly and know what's in your soil, it's really difficult to put a very specific fertility plan together. In previous episodes, we've talked a lot about your soil samples, your water, what the nutrients do, etc. But really starting there is really where you need to go. Then we get into farming. Like, what was the previous crop? What did it take out of your soil? What was my yield? And I can figure out the pounds of nutrients I took out. But to put together a fertility plan takes more than just, here it is, do this, and that'll give you this great crop. No, it won't. It might, but that would be just luck more than anything. We need to know the ins and outs of what farming's all about, and it's a removal business. You take off, I don't care if it's a grain crop, whatever you do, depending on how many bushels per acre, if you're a good farmer, 200 or 300 bushel corn farmer, everything that's in that corn was in your soil and now has been removed. So if we don't put anything back that approximates that, you're not going to be able to keep up with removal, and you will get less and less productive over time. So we need to know yields. We need to know how much of that was taken off, and then how much do I need to put back to get it back in balance. One thing, if you've got soil, it doesn't mean that you always have to put it back. If I'm in terrible excess of potassium, I need to eat it down. Some of that needs to be removed. Then I can get my balance back where I need to be so that I have the proper amount of NPK, S, and my base saturation is now balanced because I have the proper amounts of those nutrients. So sometimes just because I removed it doesn't mean I have to put a lot back, because I could be in excess. Or in some cases, depending on water sources, I may have removed a certain amount of calcium, but my water is replacing that calcium because I have some calcium bicarbonate that's building up in there, and over time I can get that mineralized back out. So the soil sample and what's in your water are really the beginning of any fertility program. So when I'm talking about fertility programs for specific crops, really need you to understand that there's a lot that goes into making a really good recommendation. I want all of my recommendations or ideas that I'd like you to either try if you're not, or confirm that you're doing a lot of good things right based on what I tell you. But it isn't a real specific one. I don't want anybody to be confused that, well, he said this and I tried it, it didn't work. Well, it didn't work because there are so many different possibilities. But I'm trying to get people's ideas wrapped around maybe a different way to approach fertility, and not just one size fits all. And this is the only thing you got to do. And if you put this on, you'll have wonderful crops. All of those things really don't exist, They're really hard to find any magic thing to do into your crop, or what we like to call that silver bullet. So all I need to do is just have that one thing, and it makes everything work right. There's a lot more science to this, and it just doesn't work that way. The only time it does work is if you have everything in perfect balance except for this one, and you put it in and you get this big response, because it's the yield limiting factor that is holding you back, is the fact that you don't have enough of that to basically make the kind of crop that you need and get the balance of all nutrition. Could be as simple as one little micronutrient that's totally deficient, and you add it and you get a tremendous response because everything else is in balance. But it doesn't happen very often. So don't be looking for that. Look for good, solid fertility.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about the topic for today's episode, which are dry beans.
Of these crops somewhat grow the same and have a few different little nuances to each. But we're going to talk about dry beans today. Dry beans is a huge crop in the United States and is grown in a lot of places over the world. The one that everybody probably is most familiar with is soybean. And soybeans are used for so many things. I'm not going to talk a lot about all the uses of soybeans, but they are one of the major crops planted around the world. And particularly in the Midwest, it's been a great rotational crop for the Midwest corn and bean farmers. Basically, they're planting maybe corn, followed by soybeans, followed by corn. Some people will be on a rotation of 2 crops of corn and then soybeans. Some people will be on, depending on price, they may want 1 corn crop and 2 soybean crops, depending on where the market is. So we're trying to chase a profitability more. A lot of people like to plant the dry beans because they aren't as they don't demand as many total pounds of nutrients, because we're not building a 10 to 12 foot high canopy with all that leaf surface and the grain that's on that corn crop and all the energy that we need transported to make that crop successful, as far as we do on beans. The other thing about beans, of course, that everyone loves is that they're a legume. And what that means is they fix nitrogen. It means they take nitrogen from the air and actually put it into their into the plant and basically fix it and store it down in the nodules, down in the roots in the ground. So some people are of the mind, though, and they make a mistake and say that, well, since it fixes nitrogen, I don't need to apply any. And even the best farmers, I think, will always benefit from adding, depending on the number of pounds that you need that crop to grow, well, 85 to 90% of it's going to be fixed, and the other 10 to 15% needs to be applied. Now, over a period of time, it might be able to fix the total number of pounds of nitrogen. The problem is, do you have the nitrogen there when you need it, okay? And that's when that extra 10 to 15% that you may apply on the needs are applied during that growing season, when it really is in the biggest demand. You have a big elongation, or your setting beans, or all, to make sure you have enough at those critical times. So in California, we have a lot of other different dry beans. And one of the things, too, I always like to talk about is, what are you trying to do with a bean? With a corn plant, if it's going for grain, yeah, you're trying to make the kernels of corn. Or on silage, you're trying to make a good, strong, healthy plant with a lot of nutrition and a lot of grain. But in a dry bean crop, we're trying to produce really that reproductive part. So there is a lot of beans that are grown for seed, depending on where you're at. You know, out here in California, we have a lot of seed fields because we have control. I don't want to say we have control of the weather, but we have control of the ability to irrigate at the time we need to maximize the reproductive capabilities of that beans, which is the beans that we're trying to grow, is what we're trying to do, and put the nutrition into them so that we produce a very viable seed with a great germination rate percentage, and that bean then can be sold and taken and grow over many fields with just that one field. So we're trying to fill the pods in there with the most beans that we can do. If possible, is get them in there.
Now Bill's going to talk about the importance of phosphate in growing dry beans.
Into a dry bean crop is phosphate. One reason, it's a seeded crop, and that seeded crop will always do better with some early phosphate getting it into that crop. And so that we want that root mass to develop. And we also want that later on to get enough phosphate into that to give us the biggest, most massive leaf surface that we can, so we can maximize both photosynthesis and respiration to make this plant the most efficient it can be, and be able to gather the most amount of energy that we can turn, so we can really put it into the maximum number of beans per pod. There's a lot of things you can apply at planting in the forms of starters, but if you have a deficient field that's really deficient in phosphate, and if you have a livestock, you probably have built phosphate over time, and you may be able to get by with just a starter. But if you haven't had livestock and you've been farming it in corn and then beans and corn and beans back and forth, or 2 crops of corn and then a crop of beans, you may not have ever built the phosphate levels up. And because of that, you will always have not as good a success with beans because they really need to get in to phosphate early to make their bush and grow and get a plant of good stature and not slow it down like you will if you have not enough phosphate in. So a lot of times then a pre-plant of something like 1152O in a dry form, or you can put on a liquid of a 1034O, and you can broadcast, spray it on ahead of that and work it in, incorporate it, or put the same with the 1152O. And that'll give you probably, if you look at, depending on, say, 1152O, if you're using a couple 100 pounds, you're probably there with your nitrogen. And it's also ammonium-based that's in that that 1152O, or it's ammonium-based in the 1034O. You're not going to leach that nitrogen out. So it's going to hang around. It's a reproductive form of what the plant recognizes as reproductive. And it helps get your plant off to the right start to think reproductively right from the time that germinates. And that can have a big help to you as it begins to get closer and closer to the time where it wants to form pods, fill them with beans, get them pollinated. So our next situation that you do that, even with that, we still would want to put in starter phosphate. And a lot of those are good mixes these days of NP and K. You don't need much nitrogen in them, but you almost always, every one of them's got to carry about 1 part nitrogen to 3 parts phosphate to get it in there. Potassium is also good because you're going to want the good standability. If you're going to grow a really good crop, you're going to have a really good sized plant, and that plant needs to stand, and that's a function of potassium. So that potassium also really good to get into that starter fertilizer and get it going. The other thing that we like with those NPKs is that potassium. If we get it in early, we've got a base to start from, and then it can begin to feed and mineralize out the potassium you have available. The demand for potassium is not as big as it is in, say, a larger plant like a corn crop because of the height and the standability you need and the cell wall strength that you need, but you still need to have that bush to stand. And if we get a nice size plant, obviously some are more upright. A lot of our dry beans in California are more low stature, where we'll get soybeans to grow up higher. Back in the Midwest, we don't really grow any soybeans out here in California because of our harvest temperatures, because they get a little too dry, and they very hard to harvest here in real low humidity. So we haven't seen hardly any soybeans grown in California. But that standability is important for any plant because nothing really does well laying flat on the ground. And so some early potassium, and depending on where your soil sample said, you may be able to, if you have a 3 to 5% base saturation of potassium and a modest, exchange capacity, meaning the amount of clay and sand you have, but a lighter soil down to about a 10 up to about a 20, 3 to 5 is probably going to supply you with enough potassium. But if you keep not putting any on, even for your bean crop, you're not going to have enough for the corn crop that follows. Here in other areas of the country, I should say, where you're working on just not a corn and bean rotation, you're working on other crops, you have an opportunity to actually come back and making sure you have enough potassium, because maybe the next crop has got, it's your money crop. You may be going into something, and that bean crop is just setting you up for your next crop that you come behind it. We have a lot of people that like to plant a bean crop, a legume, and have that stored nitrogen in those nodules, then be available to the next crop. We've seen some tremendous crops of silage corn grown behind a bean crop. And so because of that, they fit. But normally, we really have to pay close attention to the potassium, because if we're not careful, we will get deficient, and then we'll have trouble with that corn crop standing. So it gets really vigorous because of nitrogen, but then it wants to not stand. So it's just something to be careful for.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about something that might get overlooked when growing dry beans, which is sulfur.
Unless it just comes along for the ride. because they're not putting on any nitrogen. So they're not putting on a product like, ammonium sulfate pre-plant, because they're not needing that much nitrogen. But they really probably do need the sulfur. So somewhere in our program, we need to find a place in that pre-plant. If it's 1152, it's maybe going back with 80 to 100 pounds of elemental sulfur. And if you're in a place where you've got blending, or you have a multiple application where you can put multiple units in a large spreading equipment and go across there and put in sulfur at a lower rate, 1152 at a higher rate, maybe potassium at a lower rate, and blend those all together as you're spreading them out through across the field. Multiple ways to do things. You can do the same thing with a spray. You'll need to find a sulfur. There aren't a lot of really good liquids. Most of the time, you're going to have to use a product like a thiosulfate, and that would be maybe a potassium thiosulfate. These become maybe not as practical in low-value crops because of the expense. So we're always looking at, if you're a seed field or a seed grower, then you're going to make money based on the viability of the crop and all, meaning the germination percentages that you get from your crop, or also you're going to get paid on the volume and the size and how much energy is that, so that they germinate well and have plenty of energy to get to the surface when they're planted. Those are all going to be something that you might be able to invest more into the crop to get a return from. So somewhere in that program, and there's a few opportunities to put sulfur in there, I highly recommend it. You'll get a little bit bigger diameter in your stalk, which you'll be able to hold more of crop. If you can keep your sulfur rate up, that stalk, or if you look at I'm familiar with I worked on a lot of tree crops, but I've worked on a lot of corn crops too. You can get a larger diameter of the trunk or of the stalk by somewhere at least 1.25 to 1.5 times by keeping the sulfur up. It will give you a stronger plant and a better base. And that bean crop can then have more standability and will be able to, have more ability. That bigger, I always call it the growing tube, that stalk or that trunk of a tree has more ability to deliver more nutrients because it has a bigger straw. It has a bigger diameter of able to pull more nutrients with water from the soil and get it into the plant.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about the ever so popular micronutrients.
And I normally just talk about the first 5, but don't forget the other ones like molybdenum, cobalt, but the boron, manganese, iron, copper, and zinc are what we really look at. And most of them we can find in a mix. They're always good, and I always like micros in a foliar, particularly if you have fast-growing crops, because it can pick them up gradually from the soil if you've got lower levels. But we can get an instantaneous uptake if we've got a good quality foliar that we can apply to good, strong, healthy foliage, which is why you got the rest of your your nutrient profile put together, that we want to be able to do that. We get back to boron, and it's essential for pollination, and also puts a lot of the starch from the leaves and puts it into that bean as it matures. Those two functions make boron very, very important for any seeded crop that we're trying to grow. So boron at somewhere between at least 1 part per million in your soil test up to 2, depending if you have plenty of calcium, you can push it towards 2. If you don't, then we will have to slide it back closer to 1 to 1.5. The other thing you need to pay close attention to, and this is why put a nutrient on just because I know what it does for me if I already have plenty there. Because boron has always been a little's good, a lot is not so good. It can have a lot of toxic effects. So somewhere once we get over that 2 and above, we can start to see detrimental effects. And so there's no real sense of putting more on. Why could we have lots of boron? Because it will leach over time too, because it really is not hanging on to the soil colloid, and it moves through the soil profile with water over time, not as fast as something that is repelled from those soil colloids, but something that really is not attached to the soil colloid either. And so you can leach it through. But you may be adding all the boron and maybe in some cases too much boron by what you have in your water. So a lot of times we'll look at the amount of boron in water, and when we look at that, we have to be careful because it could be a small part per million, and if we're using that as our irrigation source, you need to figure out how many gallons you're putting on, and then figure out 8 pounds per gallon and figuring out the total weight. And I'll do something that makes the math work really easy. You could add 1 million gallons per acre. That's about a little over 3 acre feet. Maybe it's half of that. So let's not say that. Let's go to half, okay? Half of that, which is 500,000 gallons, foot and a half. Well, then come back and it weighs about 8 pounds. That's 4 million pounds of water we're applying per acre. And if we have a small amount, 2 parts per million in our soil, but we're putting on 4 million pounds, we're putting on 8 pounds of borons, which will raise you 4 parts per million. So you could get into trouble just so easily by not knowing what's in your water. So if you're doing your water test, at least have a beginning point of where you're at so that you can then do that. You can also find things like my beans get way too bushy, and then you find out you've got too many parts per million, which ends up being pounds of nitrogen, and now you're putting way over the top of nitrogen, and it's all going to growth, vegetative, and we can't slow them down because as the more we water, the more we're fertilizing. So what's in that water, really, really critical. So be careful with boron, and then of course we can see iron, manganese, copper. I've hardly ever seen zinc, but I've seen a lot of iron and manganese. And normally those are real bad because they create a lot of slimes and plug up your irrigation system, etc. But we usually don't. Something to know you have, but if you don't have any, you're probably not going to have any in the immediate future. So not too much to worry about, but at least put them on your radar screen. But iron, anybody that's grown a bean crop, you love that dark forest green color that you want. The beans look healthy, they look great. You need that iron to keep that up so we don't get any chlorosis and slow down the plant growth and have it wanting for other nutrients. So the one thing about iron that you need to also check when you're worried about low iron, and maybe your soil sample says you're low, but iron is one of the few nutrients that you can take up deeper in the soil. So you can get it taken up from those deeper places in the soil. And because of that, that will allow you to get enough iron into that plant, and it'll travel up, it'll supply you. And just go off of your tissue tests. Look at the soil test. Look how the crop performs. Look at your tissues. If you're getting enough, just stand by and not have to apply that iron that would be needed if you weren't having enough iron in that plant. So this is one place I really like to do a tissue test because they really give me a good indication on iron. Am I getting enough low if I'm not very high in my soil? If I got high soil numbers, then I usually hardly ever see an iron deficiency.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about manganese.
It's key to a lot of things. One is the formation of lignin for that stalk. People don't look at the stalk as being much in beans, but if you've ever seen beans that have a hard time standing, and a lot of them, if you're furrow irrigating and a lot of them are down in the furrow, it's hard to keep them from getting fungal diseases, rotting, all kinds of things. So we want them up off the ground. We want that standability. And so manganese will help that because you need it for the formation of lignin. But really where it really pays off for manganese and having the levels there is for the set. Getting beans to set in the pod. I've seen guys look out and go out into, here we'll do black-eyed beans, and when they open that pod up on a field that's real low in manganese, and they only got 3 or 4 beans in. Pod formed perfectly, but we don't have enough. And it's funny, a little foliar manganese, and all of a sudden those 3 or 4 went to 6 or 8. So everything's the same, you just don't have the crop. It can really have a reduction on crop. There's other things that could lead to that low pollination, boron and others, but one of the ones that I found that not a lot of people look at is manganese. Been very, very helpful with teaching farmers how to get more set by getting enough manganese into their crop. Copper, good for resiliency. You get high temps and then it cools off. The beans always come back better after these high temperatures if they have enough copper in the natural resiliency in crops. It also gives it a little bit of fungal disease protection. It's like, I like to say, it's nature's fungal natural fungicide. And so again, really good for plant health is to have enough copper. It doesn't take a lot of copper, 5 parts per million in your soil. And if you just continue to work on it, it's a very expensive product to buy. Copper's an expensive micronutrient, but if you put a little bit over time, you'll eventually build it up. It's one that you can measure almost pound for pound every year for what you put on to how much it will raise it. The other thing is that it can be also applied foliar with a foliar mix. Should also mention, if I looked at my soil test and I was really low of zinc and pretty good on everything else, I would still put on all the micronutrients, the manganese, copper, zinc, and iron, because they'll work better together. They're synergistic. They work better together when they're applied. Now, if you're real low of zinc, then zinc would become your highest in the percentage. Most of these will say it's a 5% zinc solution with a 2% manganese, a 0.5% copper, and maybe 0.5% iron. And so that's what you would put on. But if zinc was high, you might change that around and find one that's higher in manganese. It's the 5% manganese and the 2% zinc and the 0.5% copper. So whatever you're the most low or having trouble getting it up in tissues, that's the one you bump to the highest. You look at all the different foliars and make sure that it's one that is readily absorbed. A lot of the new ones that are amino acid based or phosphate based are probably the best. I try to stay away from some of the chelated materials. Some are carbon-based chains that are also really nice. But the ones like EDTA, one of the problems is that they'll get in, but they'll have issues once they get into plants. It's a long discussion to talk about all the different foliars. But just work with some that get in. That's the number one thing. If they don't get in, they're very expensive. A cover that you put on the outside and any rain probably washes them off. So they have to cross that barrier and actually go through the lamina to get into the leaf surface to be translocated across the leaf surface. So make sure you've got a good one. And if you do, there's plenty out there. I'm not in the business of advertising anybody's product is better than anybody else's. But there are a lot of differences out there. Make sure you get one that's chelated properly. Work with your crop advisor, field advisors, and read. In addition to listening to me, hopefully you're reading up on some of the things I talk about. So that's it for beans. Getting them to mature at the end of the year is a function of potassium. Make sure you don't short it too much and get them clear to the end so that they're fully formed, not shriveled, and basically would get good yields to give you great profitability. It's a big crop in the U.S., and a lot of people I think would benefit from understanding how to help them be better than they've experienced in the past. And it starts with, again, soil test, finding out what's missing, what we need to add, and what that specific plant needs more of than others. So until next time, and we'll be looking at more crops. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for another absolutely fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that everyone listening loved to hear what you had to say about how to properly fertilize your dry beans. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.